Such a rich reading from the Gospel of John today, it's hard to know where to start for the preacher. So many pithy sayings calling out to be made the topic of today's sermon. Like when Jesus sees the two fellows following him and he asks them, "What are you looking for?" That question goes right to the heart of the whole human condition, doesn't it? Because most of us don't really know what we're looking for most of the time. And these two probably didn't either, because they're tagging along after a stranger on the advice of John the Baptist, a guy who eats locusts. Most of us don't know what we're looking for, but alas, I have already preached that sermon, and I hope you remember it. Then there's Jesus' invitation, come and see. Here's Jesus issuing a summons into his whole life and purpose, and that could preach. But alas, that has already been preached as well by me. Today, though, I'm struck with a new thought and a new realization. I'm struck by the way John the Baptist points two of his own followers toward Jesus, and those two then, one of them, Andrew, brings his brother toward Jesus, and in just a few verses which we did not read, Philip, another, will bring Nathanael to Jesus. And all of this coming to Jesus hints at something that is perhaps the most uncomfortable topic in the whole Christian faith. Something so awkward that we so-called mainline Protestants don't even talk about it, pretty much ever. What is that topic? Is it faith healings? Is it speaking in tongues? Is it snake handling? Is it clapping in church? No, it's even harder than those. It's the E word, and you know the one, evangelism. Evangelism. That is some scary, scary stuff. Let's talk about evangelism. I know, I'm squirming too. I'm squirming just as much as you are. Evangelism can sound so fanatical. It's not the domain of polite religious people, is it? It bears the distinctive whiff of the day before yesterday. When we hear about evangelism, we think of knocking on doors, and nobody wants a stranger knocking on their door anymore, do they? It's almost alarming when somebody knocks on your door these days. When we hear the word evangelism, we think of passing out tracts, proselytizing. It conjures images of enthusiastic preachers in business suits, stadiums full of emotionally expressive people, and I think that's the thing that you and I like the least, shows of emotion. We can't stand those. They make us so uncomfortable. But many of you have been asking about my most recent trip to Cameroon, and I said that I would tell you about it in today's sermon so that I could say it once rather than 50 or 60 times. I did just get back from yet another trip to Cameroon, where there was indeed a soccer stadium full of enthusiastic, emotional people. And there were more than one preachers. There was more than one preacher in business suits. And there was dancing. And there were shows of emotion. And I'm told that there were faith healings, though I left at 3 a.m. before those started. Actually, here's how it all went down. The child I took in when I lived in Cameroon was finally getting ordained, and he flew me back to Cameroon to participate in that service of ordination. It was a joy to go back again so soon, having just been back there at Thanksgiving, and it was so much warmer there. And it was shocking to arrive in the capital city of that country to actually see my face on billboards. On billboards in the capital city, advertising this event, which went from 8 o'clock on a Friday night. Can you imagine if we had a Friday night church service here? We could hold it in the smallest classroom. Which went from 8 o'clock on a Friday night until 6:30 on Saturday morning. My godson told me, "Don't worry, the older people can leave," and he was trying to be diplomatic. The older people can leave at midnight, which did not happen. I didn't get to leave until 3. I left just as the faith healings were starting. There were Christian music concerts, there was a lot of dancing, there was an evangelistic sermon, an evangelistic crusade, and all of it in a soccer stadium with 4,500 people, I am told. It didn't look like quite that many to me, but it was a lot. But the first item on the agenda was the ordination of my godson, of which I was in charge, and he said, "Do it the Presbyterian way. I want you to wear all your stuff." And all the many clergy entered the worship space, the soccer stadium, as the worship band reverently sang the church's one foundation. They were trying to go as high church as they knew how. We did the Apostles' Creed, and we had a reading from Mark, after which I stood behind something akin to a pulpit, and I preached in my usual way, except in French, a language that tasted like a lot of rust in my mouth after 22 years of disuse. It helped that I got to write all the words down beforehand. The audience listened politely, and some of them shook their heads occasionally, but I could tell this is not what they expected. The old bald guy in the black robe, this is not at all what they were thinking. The sermon was followed by the ordination, vows, and the laying on of hands, all very traditional Protestant stuff, which my godson, as I said, told me he wanted. For though he is no longer Presbyterian, he became a Christian in a Presbyterian church, and he wanted his ordination to reflect his roots, even if his current practice did not. He was ordained on behalf of an independent church. And I have to say, that huge audience of 4,500, but maybe more like 3,000, looked pretty bored while I was speaking, while I was up there talking at them in my thick, metallic-sounding accent. Now, they had a preacher just after me that really caught their attention. He really got them worked up, jumping and clapping and yelling their amens. My godson told me afterward, "Don't feel bad about that." It was like you were playing the cello and he was playing the saxophone. Two very different things that you appreciate in different ways. That did help a little, but I didn't feel worthy of the billboards. One thing that caught my attention, the traditional shaman, that's to say what we used to call a witch doctor, of my godson's village, was in attendance at that event, wearing his traditional headdress, which is hard to describe. This man is what we used to call a witch doctor, though we don't call them that anymore. He was a shaman, an animist priest, who leads the village in their regular ceremonies and prayers to the ancestors. And when he was introduced to me, I remembered from years ago that you're not allowed to look them in the eyes, and you're not allowed to shake their hands. And you're not allowed to walk toward them. If they walk toward you, that's fine. And so I just stood there and clasped my own hands and bowed my head and smiled my greeting, because that's what you're supposed to do. Obviously, he was not a Christian, but my godson was a child of his village, and one of his own was undergoing a major life event, and he thought he should be present. I was impressed by that. Later, then a few days later, at a dinner, many of the dignitaries from that event were invited, and the shaman stood up to give a speech. And he said, yes, it was strange for me to be in such a big Christian gathering, but that he felt respected by everybody in that place, most especially the clergy. And he went on to say, life has many paths. Most of them are good. A few of them are bad. You cannot choose the direction that your child will go in life, but as long as they live respectfully and honestly, you support that child, even if their path is not your path. I was impressed by that. I thought that was a very generous take on that event from a so-called witch doctor. And after this, an older member of my godson's family stood up and said to him, looking at him, we were not there for you when you were a child. And they're right. He was homeless. We were not there for you when you were a child. But look, we're here now. He came pretty close to apologizing. And that was a moment of deep healing. That was a moment of God's presence, a moment of grace. Then, of course, they had to ruin it all by asking me to give a speech, for which I was not prepared. I did not come with my notes, and I always have to have notes. And so while I got up and stammered, people's eyes glassed over and their stomachs growled, and they couldn't wait for dinner. I could add nothing to the power and the beauty of that moment. And I thought to myself, this shaman, they should have had him on the billboards, because he said something worth hearing. And this member of my godson's family, they should have had him on the billboards, because he said the most important thing that's been said on that trip. The shaman showed us all grace and goodwill just by being present. And he stayed until 6:30 in the morning. Unlike yours truly. All in all, it was a grace-filled, beautiful time when I felt the presence of God in new and in healing ways. And if that's not evangelism, good news, what is? What is? For my heart, too, needs come to Jesus moments. My heart, too, needs called back to Jesus in ways that I perhaps don't know. Conversion is not just a once-in-a-lifetime event. It's something we ought to experience again and again as we joyfully turn away from everything in us that's stuck and broken and ugly and turn toward all that is good and beautiful, all that is lovely, all that is as it should be, all that is Christ. Any and all things that turn us toward the one that we call Christ is evangelism. And so, let's talk about the E word. Let's talk about evangelism. You know, in these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the regular ones, the ones they call synoptic, we mostly see Jesus calling people to himself. He turns up on the beaches where they're mending their nets or where they're fishing, or else the tax booths where they're doing the will of the Roman Empire. And he says, come to me, follow me, leave all this stuff, and come with me. And I like that, because in my life, as probably in yours, Christ has very often turned up unexpected and uninvited and said, hey, do better. Do something else. Come follow me. That's been true for me sometimes, and probably for you. But here in the opening chapters of John, as is usual with John, we've got a whole different way of looking at things. People are brought to Jesus by their friends, mostly. John the Baptist says to a few of his own followers, hey, this is Jesus. And then one of those guys, Andrew, says to his brother, hey, come see Jesus. And then in the next passage, Philip brings Nathanael to Jesus, and so on. And I like this vision, too, of how people come to Christ and how they are called, because I, like you, have sometimes missed Christ altogether until I saw Christ in the life of another person. Sometimes we have to see Christ in another person before we can come to him, the beauty and the love that we call Christ. I can embrace Christ when I see you embracing Christ. And I am likely to turn from Christ when I see you turning from Christ. It's just how we herd animals work, isn't it? We all lead people Christward or away from Christ, and most of us do a little bit of both in our lives. We do it with our words and our behaviors. We do it with how we treat people or how we fail to treat them. We do it with how we speak to them or ignore them. If you're living a life plugged into all that is good and true and beautiful, if you are living in daily life-giving communion with all that is Christ, then I'm probably going to look at your life and see something that I like, and the Christ in you is going to call out to me, and I'm going to want more of it. The Christ that I see in you will call me to himself through you, even if I don't know his name. Maybe even if you do not. Our lives and our living, our words and our speaking, are evangelism. And quite often they're counter-evangelism too. No church growth strategy takes this into account. If people meet Christ in us, they will be drawn to the Christ beyond us. I need to see Christ in you so that I can find the Christ inside of me and outside. We all lead people to Christ and away from him, and we almost always do it without mentioning Christ's name. Now, you didn't think you were going to get out of here without a word study, did you? Silly congregation. Of course there has to be a word study. The root word of evangelism is evangel, or euangel in Greek, euangelion. And that's perhaps part of the problem for many people. Let's take that word apart. Euangel, euangelion. Eu, the prefix, just means good. It's like eulogy, EU, logi, good word, eulogy, good study. Good word that you speak about somebody's life, usually after they've died, though why we can't do it while they're still alive, I don't know. A eulogy is a good word. And so a euangel, what does angel mean? Angel, message, good message. All it means is the good news. All it means is a good message. But the problem is that it rings of another word that we have mixed feelings about, and that is the word evangelical and evangelicalism, which more and more people in our society associate more with politics than with spirituality. I mean, it just means good news. It just means good message. Indeed, one wise pastor in our presbytery, when he was asked if he was still an evangelical, explained, "No, in the 21st century, I can no longer identify as an evangelical, but I am full of good news." That was David Carver, I'm sure some of you know. Our lives proclaim the good news, but sometimes they proclaim bad news. Or sometimes our lips proclaim good news when our lives proclaim something else altogether. True evangelism is living in such a way that people see Christ in us and they want Christ. People are drawn to what they see in you: humility, grace, compassion, forgiveness. These are the E word. They're irresistible. It's just really hard to talk to people about your faith, isn't it? Even when you've got a pulpit to hide behind, it's hard. And when you don't have a pulpit, it's really, really hard because there's been so much religious browbeating in our society. Many folks just get immediately defensive or uncomfortable as soon as anything religious arises in the conversation. There's a lot of potential for things to go south when you talk about religion. Catholic versus Protestant, Presbyterian versus Baptist, mainline versus evangelical. Do you dunk or do you sprinkle? My least favorite, spiritual versus religious, as if you couldn't possibly be both. Then there's the old vision of coming to Jesus that's set so deep in our American psyche that even Hollywood is on board with it. You find it in that wonderful old film, "O Brother, Where Art Thou?" when the dim-witted prison escapee Delmar sees a group of Baptists in their white robes all marching down to the river and singing so beautifully, and they're going into the river to repent of their sins and to be baptized. And he wants it. He wants to be changed. He wants to be redeemed. He wants God. He wants a fresh start and a clean slate. He desires it with all his heart. He also wants it because he thinks that if he does it, the police will stop chasing him. He doesn't understand that part. He wants it so much that he goes splashing down into the water, cutting ahead in the line in front of everybody. And he gets dunked and washed clean. He's made a new person with a new day. And that is a beautiful thing. I've known many people who have had that experience, and I've had a few experiences like that myself. And they're life-changing. It happens like that sometimes, but not always. Not always. The conversion of the heart is not always dramatic. And it's not always sudden. Sometimes it takes place over the course of many years. Sometimes it comes without a splash and without a sound. That's why I love the hymn, the Christmas carol, O Little Town of Bethlehem. How silently the wondrous gift is given. Thus God imparts to human hearts the blessings of God's heaven. No ear may hear his coming, but in this world of sin, where meek souls will receive him still, the dear Christ enters in. How silently. There's no recipe for coming to Jesus. There's no step-by-step system to describe the way he comes into a human life. The sawdust trail, the altar call, the four spiritual laws, the Romans road to salvation, the sinner's prayer of repentance, these have all figured prominently in American evangelism, beginning with the Puritans who invented the crisis point conversion. I have only two complaints about these things. The first is they treat the work of the Spirit like a predictable chemical reaction that can and must take place in every person. And second, they treat God like someone whose first urge is to punish us. Is that really God's first urge? To punish? I mean, true, in some ways we are guilty and need to be forgiven, but we're also broken and need to be healed. We're also exiled and homesick and need to be brought back home to God. We're also enslaved and need to be set free. Let's not begin with God's supposed condemnation of us, but with our need for the welcome and the grace and the goodness and the home that God is. Coming to Jesus is not about escaping the fires of hell. It's not about fear and judgment. Jesus is more than a ticket into a good seat in the afterlife. He is a model for our living in this life, and for our loving, and for our serving, and for our being. He's a parable for what it is to die to the old life and live to a new one, an emblem of the new life that comes on the other side of suffering and pain and loss. Coming to Jesus is about embracing the love for which you are created. Now, do I hope that you will encourage your friends to come to church? Yes, actually, I do. What we do here is good for your soul, and we all need regular doses of things that are good for our souls. And I hope that a regular experience of church gives us the strength and the courage and the joy to be the people that we are called to be in our lives and in this world. But the point of this sermon on evangelism is that people will be drawn to the Christ they find in you, and not by you telling them that they need to become Christians. People are looking for things to believe, things into which they can invest their energies in good ways. And the best evangelism that I've ever seen is to live in peaceful communion with God and with other people. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The preacher at my own ordination used that verse to build her sermon. And when I hear it, I'm still called back to Jesus in a powerful way, for I hear myself in that verse sometimes. Heavy laden, weary, tired, sometimes. Yes, I'm a pastor, but I still need to be converted every day, every single day, because I, like you, lose track of the light. I get lost. I forget the things that matter, and I chase after things that don't. Old wounds draw me back into ugly places. Voices of fear and anxiety still whisper in my ear, and I'm tempted sometimes, like you, to wander in the shadows, where it's easy to get lost, just like you. But if I see you living in the light, it's easier for me to come out and live in the light. If I hear you expressing love for your neighbor, it's easier for me to feel love for my neighbor. If I hear you offering forgiveness, then I might just give it a go myself. If I see you loving the person that you are, it'll be easier for me to love the person that I am. If I see Christ in you, I will be drawn to the Christ in you, yes, but beyond you and above you. In the film As Good as It Gets, which just might be a candidate for Lentflix this year, in the film As Good as It Gets, the despicable character played by Jack Nicholson has a moment of clarity when he's sitting in a restaurant with, I think it's Helen Hunt, and she's the woman who is trying very hard to be in love with him, but he's so awful to everybody. And he says to her in his moment of clarity, "You make me want to be a better man." It's one of those great moments in cinematography, though I don't see it registering on many people's faces. And she declares, "That is the best compliment that anybody has ever given me. You make me want to be a better person." Our living should make people want to be better people. Our loving should make them want to love better. Our being should make them want to be better. But for this to happen, we must live our lives plugged into the beauty and the wonder and the goodness that we have named Christ. This is evangelism. Living our lives in such a way that people open themselves to the possibility of being better. An African shaman nudged me a little closer to Christ recently. Strange to say, conversion is not a once-in-a-lifetime event. It's something that we experience again and again as our hearts forever turn away from everything that's broken and everything that's fearful toward everything that is good and everything that's right and everything that as it should be and everything that is Christ. Amen.